Hello and welcome to Flashes of Insight. Probably no issue in the Catholic Church today is more hot than the question of women in ministry. And that takes a particular form in the Catholic Church because of the question of women and ordination. And that takes a focused form in the case of whether women can, should, or will be ordained to the diaconate. There's four of us here. We've all worked on the history of the church in various ways. We've all worked on the question of ministry. We have all looked at how the tradition informs the present, and we're all interested in how ministry will evolve in the future as the church seeks to carry on its mandate to be the witness to the Christ in the world. So without any more ado, I want to turn to Phyllis Zagano and say, Phyllis, tell us where we are on the question of women in the diaconate and where do you think we should be going?
Well, thanks, Tom. It's great to be with you. Where are we and where should we go? Well, that's an interesting combination. Where we are, at least at this point in time, is maybe where we should be. And by this, I mean, the past is clear. No one's going to argue that women were not deacons. Women clearly in our many churches' histories were ordained, and the argument is in many cases they were sacramentally ordained to serve as deacons and to serve as deacons fully in different places in different times. Now, can I argue that every woman deacon in the past did the same as every man deacon in the past? Of course not, for several reasons. First of all, the scattering of the churches and the different rights that we have, but also the fact that we don't know what we don't know. So we are only dealing with a certain amount of literature, a certain amount of records, a certain amount of information, historical information. In the recent past, we've had a renewed interest in discussing the question of women in the diaconate, which actually was brought up both inside and outside of the conversations in the Second Vatican Council. There were two bishops, one from Peru and one from Italy, who asked about restoring women to the diaconate. And the conversation they began is still going on. One said we should have them installed, and the other said they should be ordained. The interesting thing is that outside the council meetings, there was a Maronite bishop, actually from Brooklyn, USA, who wanted to talk about the history of Maronite women deacons, and he tried to do so at the coffees in between the meetings, and no one wanted to talk to him. They didn't want to hear about the history of women ordained in the Maronite tradition. And so if we move really fast forward to 2016, we have Pope Francis standing up before the International Union of Superiors General saying, you know, I know there was a very interesting scholar, Syrian scholar, and I talked to him in the 1980s, and he talked about women in the diaconate. He said that women were really deacons. He said that sometimes a woman would complain. She'd want to complain to her bishop that her husband was beating her. And the protocol was she would go to the woman deacon, who would examine the bruises, and the woman deacon would then report to the bishop. So we find that what the bishop, the Maronite bishop, was talking about was in the air, and it was around. And the discussion continued through the 70s. Pope Paul VI reportedly asked Cipriano Bagaggini, or the entire ITC at the time, International Theological Commission, what about women deacons? We will have restored a permanent vocation of ordained men as deacons. What about women? And Bagaggini wrote a very long article that became eventually a scholarly article in Orientalia Periodica Christiana, and it was published in 1974. And my information about the genesis of this particular article comes from the now late editor of that journal, Robert Taft of the Society of Jesus. And so there was that. And then by the time we get to the 90s, 1992 to 1997, the International Theological Commission actually took the question up. And in taking the question up, there were a couple of bishops who were arguing very forcefully for women deacons as an historical fact of their ordination. Without getting too much into the weeds, I will tell you that they had a document prepared, numbered, and printed in 1997. But the prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith at the time, who was the president of the ITC, refused to sign it. And of course, that was Joseph Ratziner. And Ratziner then assigned a new subcommittee of the ITC, which worked from 1997 to 2002. And as it turned out, the 17-page document grew like Topsy and went to be 78 pages. And that document is interesting in that it says, well, concluding one, the women deacons of history weren't exactly the same as the men deacons of history. Two, there's a very clear distinction, magisterial distinction actually, between the diaconate and the priesthood. So therefore, this is something the magisterium should decide. Magisterium should decide. So it got kicked upstairs to John Paul II, who did nothing. And the next pope was Benedict XVI, who did nothing. So then we get to 2016, and the International Union of Superiors General was invited to ask 6 questions, which were sent to the Holy Father in advance. They were hand carried across the square to the Holy Father's residence at Casa Santa Marta. And the first 2 questions had to do with women deacons. And they said, why can't we be deacons? And why don't you have a commission to study this? And that's where I became part of this discussion more publicly. I think where we can go with this, and I know that the Holy Father wants this matter discussed, and I'm grateful for the opportunity for us to discuss it here, that the church, just as in the past, just as we do not have the historical evidence of everybody doing the same thing all over the place, well, that's not the way our church works. And so the church today, and actually in the coming years, will have the opportunity to discuss this and other matters that are of import to particular churches. My commission ended in 2016. We met, 2018, we met 4 times and presented papers through Cardinal Ladaria, who had a cover letter, who gave them to the Pope. I don't know exactly what the Pope got. We never received the final copies of the letter from Cardinal Ladaria, nor the final copies of our research. But I do know, because the International Union of Superiors General in 2019 in May received papers. The Holy Father said this is what the little or some of what they agreed on. And they have since said that was an historical section. So that's kind of where we are now. And in terms of the actual substance of the discussion, we have obviously the question or the reinstatement of women, or the instatement of women as installed lectors and acolytes, and now the latest motu proprio about the installed catechists. So I think that's kind of where the discussion is currently. And I guess, I want to hear what you all are thinking on this matter.
Well, that's a good point to call. You mentioned that the past is clear, but I suspect that there may be several pasts that are clear. There's the past that is clear from historical investigation, empirically trying to look at the evidence, and also there's a different type of clarity of people who take the current situation, apply the principle of it's always been the same, and therefore the origins must be the same as the development. the semper approach to history. Justin, you work on some of the earliest evidence, which is the material that we can derive from the canonical books of the New Testament. How clear is the past?
Well, I think that Gary Macy has made it very clear. He's gathered together all the evidence, both scriptural and then from the church in the first 1,000 years, that, as Phyllis said, women were deacons. And he's brought that together in the book that he and Phyllis and William T. Deitwig wrote together, Women Deacons, Past, Present and Future. And there is a lot of other literature on it also. Interestingly enough, as I was doing some very quick preparation for this conversation, since I only knew about it at the end of last week, and it's not a subject that I'm particularly knowledgeable about, I came across the fact that among the Southern Baptists in the United States, they have a very similar problem to the problem that we Catholics have, because traditionally only men could be pastors in the Southern Baptist Church. And the question also arose, well, can women be deacons? And so the debate is very similar in the Southern Baptists to the debate in the Catholic Church. And I came across an interesting article written for his fellow Baptists by a man called Thomas Schreiner. And he goes through the evidence from the New Testament, Romans 16:1, Phoebe at Cenchreae, and then 1 Timothy 3:11, reference there to women in the context of deacons, and makes a number of other points too, which are very, very sound, I think. With regard to the question, I think there's a point I would make, that the word diakonos is not a particularly sacred word or scriptural word. It comes from the contemporary secular world, and that there are many ancient inscriptions which mention diakonoi as office holders in Greco-Roman voluntary associations. Now, these Greco-Roman voluntary associations were a very familiar part of society in the late Hellenistic and early Roman periods. And they provide numerous precedents or parallels for the early church. And one of them is precisely the use of this title, diakonos, also the title of episkopos, meaning literally overseer, superintendent, etc. Diakonos, of course, has an ordinary meaning too, simply as a servant. But I think the existence of the title diakonos as an office holder in those associations means that when we come across it, whether used of a man or a woman, in a context which clearly designates office, we should take it as an office and not simply as a description of a function. So, for example, when Phoebe is talked about in these terms, Phoebe, a deacon of the church at Cenchreae, I think we have to say that that doesn't mean simply that Phoebe's been of some use to her fellow Christians at Cenchreae and she's been a good servant. It means she's an office holder. The other passage that's often cited in this particular controversy or discussion is from 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 8 to 11. Of course, the first epistle of Paul to Timothy is often regarded as not authentically Pauline, but that doesn't really affect our purposes here because it's certainly canonical scripture. In that passage there, 1 Timothy 3, 8 to 11, Paul, or the author, speaks first of all about the qualities necessary in deacons, diakonoi. They must be serious, not double-tongued, etc., etc., etc. And then he goes on, women likewise must be serious, not slanderers, but temperate, faithful in all things. And then immediately he goes on to talk once again about diakonoi. The question there is the women, how do we take those? Now, people who don't believe that there were women deacons in the early church will tend to translate that as wives. And there are even versions which put in the word their wives. Their does not exist in the Greek, but with the clear implication for those translators that the women who are talked about here must be the wives of the diakonoi. But there's no reason for thinking that. And what Paul, or the author to 1 Timothy, says about the women is exactly the sort of thing he's been saying about the diakonoi. They must be serious, not slanderers, but temperate, faithful in all things. So I think that it would be myself very tendentious, special pleading to maintain that the women there talked about in 1 Timothy 3, 8 to 11 are not on the same footing as the diakonoi. That's all I would say for the moment. There are other points that you or others or myself, Phyllis, too, would be able to make.
Could I move to you, Joe? It's one thing to talk about the church in the past, but where do you think the whole issue of women as deacons is in the church today?
Well, how long have we got?
Well, we have as long as you need. But you're a man of few words, so we'll squeeze it in.
Super. Then I'll try. I think one place I might go back to is a phrase that you used, Phyllis, which is a magisterial distinction. And then the point that Justin has made that many of the words that we have hallowed, like diakonoi and liturgia, aren't essentially Christian words, or they're not sacred words in their origin anyway. They've become that way. So I think, Phyllis, what I'd like to hear as a comment back is the magisterial distinction has died, perhaps in this sense, that when young men go through seminary training, they are taught and they understand that the diaconate is about orders and about priesthood. And so in the pastoral world, what we often say is a deacon is bloody useless. What we need is a priest. So the trouble is that with the transitional diaconate, there is a magisterial distinction that's been lost, the one that you're talking about in terms of the difference between ordained presbyter or presbyter and episcopos and what those ordinations mean, and ordination to the diaconate, or blessing ordination, as you point out in your book, is interchangeable. So I think I'd like to hear a little bit more from you around that conundrum. The second thing, Tom, to come back to how does it work now? When I was sitting there preparing for this, I'm the parish priest of 3 parishes. And in our pastoral team of 10, 8 of them are women, full-time. One is a catechist, one is the parish's manager, another is the parish's administrator. We have another woman administrating all the money. All I do is turn up on Sunday. And I manage, what I do is I manage the team. And in fact, I don't manage the parish at all. To the point that if somebody is sick and in need of a priest to follow the letter of James, somebody else comes and gets me. So I think in many ways, there is already a practical or a de facto diaconate happening, or diakonoia. There's certainly service taking place. The question that Justin raises, of course, is around office holders. So we do have office holders. The parish's manager manages all of the goods of these 3 parishes. She manages the finance committees. She manages the parish councils. She manages me. So I wonder whether there are levels of argument here in terms of practical, what's actually happening on the ground in places like New Zealand. I think there is another argument that takes place in the seminaries, because I think the seminary training has moved away over progressive years from being pastorally focused and liturgically focused to being, I don't know, sort of focused in some other place. And so those would be my comments. And therefore, I think the magisterial distinction is difficult to maintain, and the concept of the office holder is difficult to maintain, where people don't understand the difference between presbyter, episkopos, and that relationship, and diakonia and diakonia in that other.
Well, that, I think in 2006, Pope Benedict the 16th, met with the priests of Rome, his priests. And a young priest got up and said, how can we get more women in ministry? And the Pope answered, well, there are, I'm of course truncating his answer, but to your point, there are due binaro, there are two tracks, okay, and they will never meet. And I was standing on a train trestle in Rome, and I finally understood what he was talking about. No matter how far you go down, the tracks never meet. And if we think about our older cousins, the Orthodox, they are quite clear in the fact that the diaconate is not part of the priesthood. And I think the confusion comes because on the one hand, Paul VI, with Ministeria Quaedam in 1972, on the one hand, he suppressed the cursus honorum, he suppressed the minor orders and the major order of subdeacon, but on the other hand, he created the installed ministries of lector and acolyte, which were required then for ordination as deacons. So he didn't so much suppress the cursus honorum, he compressed it. And we still have the idea that when an individual becomes a lector, becomes an acolyte, although lately, since Feast of the Baptism of the Lord this year, she would be on the road to being ordained a deacon. And then if one is ordained a deacon, one would automatically be eligible to be ordained a priest, because the cursus honorum, you remember, in the 11th century, no one could be ordained a deacon, and Grecian codified this, no one could be ordained a deacon unless he, and by that time only he, was on his way to become a priest. We're in, at least in New York, we are still celebrating the feast of Gregory VII, who was the last of 37 deacons elected as Pope. And the first to insist that he be ordained as priest before he was consecrated as bishop. He was elected and then ordained on Pentecost Sunday, and then, or on Pentecost, and then consecrated on the Feast of Peter and Paul, June 29th. So that's the codification, the solidification. And in Rome, very famous street, Gregorio Sette, he's known as someone who has set a few things in stone. So I think the seminaries, yes, you have moved away from pastoral training and not actually explaining to the men that they are part of a team, which is what I hear you speaking about, Joe. So, as I said earlier at the beginning, every place doesn't do the same thing. In my own parish, we have 3 parishes which have recently been yoked, which is the term here, and it doesn't quite work that way. It's quite clerical, but we have 3 or 4 priests and we have some managers, but there's a clear pecking order, and it's not such as you described. In other dioceses in the United States, we will have PLCs, parish life coordinators, Canon 517, paragraph 2, men, women, married, single, secular, religious, who are assigned to actually manage the parishes, individual parishes, with a canonical pastor. So it's a little different from the way you work, Joe, that they, for example, the Diocese of Albany, they have 10 PLCs, parish life coordinators, but the canonical pastor is the vicar general. So it's clear to the people who's running the parish. So I think they're all, there's all different ways to manage this. And the ecclesiology, I think, is terribly exciting to just see how it's developing.
One of the things that raises is, and it's implicit in something that both of you are talking about at the moment, is the whole question of how do we change so that we get a larger and more all-embracing ministry, but at the same time, we don't end up with just more people in an incense-filled bubble and with more professional clerics. Because one of the things that unites seminarians all the way back to the time of Gregory VII is a very strong sense that they are clerics over against this passive form called the laity. So I know, for instance, there's a theologian here in Britain, Tina Beattie, and we've chatted about this. And the last thing I would like to see is the ordination of women as anything, and we end up with more clergy.
Well, yes, well, then don't ordain anyone. You either, look, if I go in with a broken leg, I want to see an orthopedist. And if I go in for confession, I want to see a priest. If I go in and I have a need for food or a need for even sometimes counseling, spiritual direction, deacons are there. And the fact is that there are a lot of different colors of flowers on the side of the road. And I think if we start painting the side of the road the same color, we have a very boring church. I think, and now we have and that's the argument you present, Tom, is the argument about the installation of catechists, which the Holy Father did with Antiquum Ministerium. I established the lay ministry of catechists. That can go in both directions. Are we having a non-clerical clericalization of the laity? Is he creating another stepping stone to being ordained a deacon? Or is he really serving the needs of the church in different parts of the world?
Okay, Joe.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and this is where I wonder if it goes back to picking up again on this concept of magisterial distinction, Phyllis, and playing around with it, not exactly as you intended it. The magisterial distinction that often plays in people's heads is that the cleric, as you say, is the one in charge, and he's the one that you go to, and that Father's blessing is better than anybody else's blessing. And I think there are some real issues here because the clericalization of more laity will not solve the problem of power, the power ordination relationship, which is often there. And I wonder whether you can't put back time, but it's almost as if the process that we need to be in is a declericalization of everybody. And then that needs to be understood in some way that it actually makes sense, so that we don't ordain women and then we've just got another lot of power bunnies, but this time they're all women rather than the men. And so I think the question there is somehow, and you come at it in your book about getting back to what is this cleric-lay distinction? What is it based on? And is it validly based on baptism and the Tria Munda, that everybody receives, or is that only given to the ordinand? And then I'd come back to this other point that you're making, the clarity around whether a deacon is ordained or blessed and what that means. Because if we keep using the word ordain a deacon, then we keep buying into the language of power, you could say, and the presumptions of ordination, so that whether the person is male or female or gender fluid, they take on the presumptions of potestas that underlie so much of what we mean when we talk about ordination.
Well, let me say this, Joe, I don't see the word potestas used any place in reference to deacons, and anybody who wants to become a deacon to get power has got a problem, because deacons don't have power. That's not in their job description. The deacons, John N. Collins really clearly has studied the word, and through history, I think we see that the deacons, the real deacons, are the ones who are preaching the gospel and acting on it. And as Pope Francis said in 2015 in Philadelphia in the United States, in Pennsylvania, when he visited here, to the assembled bishops and cardinals, that the apostles said that they realized they couldn't do everything. Their job was to preach and to pray. So they invented, and that was his word, they invented the diaconate for people to help, for people to serve in the ministry of the word, the liturgy, and charity. So I'll go back to the medical analogy. If I go to a hospital, I need an operation, I would prefer to have the so-called ordained surgeon than somebody who's very lovely and happens to work in the hospital and just happens to be the one to be operating that day. I mean, I think we have to recognize professionalism in all of this.
Yeah. Except, Phyllis, I would like to come back and say that in the presbyterate, there's no presumption of potestas, but clerics, but people who are ordained take it on. And so, I mean, I have seen in ordained deacons the whole presumption of power. And even though it might not belong to the job description, it becomes part of the way in which the ministry manifests itself through individuals, admittedly. So I just wonder whether, again, that's when you come into the structure in that way, then the structure already informs how people are going to participate in it.
Well, it does, but you know what, Joe? I can't think of the canon right now, but the ordained priest has the power of governance and jurisdiction.
Yes.
And in 1983, the 1983 code, when that was being redone or reworked, there was a conversation between what was called the German school and the Roman school. And the German school said that the laity could cooperate, and the Roman school said that the laity could share in the exercise of governance. And the German school won, and that particular canon became codified, with the exception of one comma, exactly as Joseph Ratziner wrote it. So I think we need to recognize, and potestas, the power of orders is mentioned in the Second Vatican Council in specific reference to the priest, and the power of orders there has been taken to mean the power of consecrating at the Eucharist, and also the power of relieving the burden of sin, as well as the power of governance. So I think there's an interesting tapestry that's been woven around that word power, and it does certainly. It's not just that they're ruined in seminary. Okay, I think that if they read the documents, that's what's in the documents.
Justin, could I come back to you at this point, because we've had the reference to the famous origin story in Acts. The apostles are too busy, and they get they bring on the second team who will look after the distribution, the daily distribution. How neat is that distinction? And to what extent are we actually dealing with a codification of two nomenclatures? That in some churches it was bishops and deacons. In others, it was presbyters was the language that was being used. And then sometime in the 2nd century, these all became rationalized into one harmonized system. And if I could throw in another spanner, if we look at the Didache and its use of episcopoi kai diakonoi, we could actually be dealing with a hendiadis, that the overseers are to be servants. That they're actually using a code word, that these are not ordinary overseers, they're servant-like overseers.
Well, of course, we use that sort of language today. I don't imagine there's anybody who would be ordained a bishop, for example, who wouldn't begin his first sermon, "I am here to serve." And so part of our problem might be, how do we exercise an authority which a bishop is meant to exercise, and Phyllis was talking about that. How do we exercise that in a way that is not simply imitating power in the sense that it may be exercised in the political field? That's quite a problem. It involves, I suppose, a whole ascesis and a spirituality as well as anything else. On that other question, though, that more properly that you raise, Tom, I think it obviously did take time for the different offices and orders and so forth in the church to develop into a shape that we can now recognize and say, oh yes, well, that sounds very familiar to us. And so were the episcopoi in the earliest church, in the New Testament churches, for example, what exactly did they do? They seemed the word of overseers speaks for a certain function at least, and one can assume that they have the authority to guide and to govern the church insofar as that needed to be done. What else did they do? Back in 1970, Raymond Brown wrote a little book which he only intended as a popular book called Priest and Bishop. And I'm sure that he never intended this to be a very authoritative work, and many publications have discussed the question since then of the origins of presbyterate, episcopate, and so forth. But he does make one interesting point of method that I think is of some relevance to a lot of our discussions. He suggests that it may have taken some development over time for what he calls the presbyter bishop to become also the regular presider at the Eucharist. He distinguishes those roles and suggests that there may at least have been a time and places where somebody other than the episkopos or presbyter bishop presided at the Eucharist. And I think the same would be true also of the role of deacon. At what point did a deacon, for example, take a prominent part in the liturgy? At what point would a deacon, laying aside the question of the moment of whether male or female, but just a diakonos, at what point would the diakonos, for example, have proclaimed the gospel or preached? And the role of the deacon, of course, is still evolving in the church, isn't it? Because it's only quite recently that the deacon has been named as an ordinary minister of baptism, if I'm not mistaken, and as can be also the church's official witness at marriage. So we need, I think, to bear something of that fluidity and messiness in mind when we're discussing this. I think Phyllis was making a very similar point earlier on. And the point that I had prepared some of those remarks to say that whatever a diakonos was and did at Cenchreae about AD 58, there's no reason to think that Phoebe would not be it and do it simply because she was a woman. You asked about the so-called founding narrative. This is Acts chapter 6, 1 to 6. That reads very well. It looks as if here we are, the apostles are setting up a new ministry in the church, and they are going to devote themselves, the apostles, the 12, to the service of the word, whereas they're no longer going to be distracted with waiting on tables. That's all going to be done by the 7. It's interesting that the word diakonos doesn't occur in that narrative, although the verb diakonein, to serve, and the noun diakonia, service, is used twice there: service of tables, service of the word rather, and then the daily service, of which the widows of the Hellenists seem to be disfavored. But the longer you look at that narrative and the sequel in Acts, the more it sounds a bit strange. Of the 7 who are chosen in this new role, only 2, Stephen and Philip, are mentioned, and they are mentioned, well, with quite long narratives. They are preaching and teaching. They are not serving tables at all. And the suggestion has been made that the origin of this story was the installation of 7 office bearers for the Hellenist, the Greek-speaking community of the Jews who believed in Jesus at Jerusalem. And that this has been remolded into a story about the institution of a new ministry, i.e. the diaconate, giving us what appears to be a very satisfactory account of the origin of a new ministry, of a new order in the church. I just add there before I conclude that the fact that the 7 who are instituted in this narrative, for whatever purpose, the fact that they're all males does not seem to have been taken in the early church as a precedent binding on all successive generations that only males can be diakonoi. That's quite clear from what we were saying at the beginning of this conversation, the evidence that Phyllis has spoken of, Gary Mace and others. That's all I would find to say at the moment, Tom.
Joe, would you like to come in and we've been exploring where we are now. We've explored where we're coming from. Where do you think we're going to go?
Well, again, I think it's a vexed question. I think at a real and practical level, we are already at the place where women are serving in diaconal roles. And I think every parish priest who's got any wits about him knows that already. All he has to do is look out from his presider's chair at the congregation and can see that if the women left that afternoon after his homily or during his homily, he'd be talking to probably, I don't know, 1/10 of the congregation. And so I think what we need to do is look again at this evidence and popularize it. And I think part of that is enabling people to see that women ministry is not a threat to the men, and that it's really just part and parcel of the church evolving in its understanding of diaconia. And this is Justin's point, I think, and also Phyllis earlier, that there is no straight line trajectory here with what we've done. And it is an evolution, and it's coming again. I think the resistance to women in ministry is, again, this whole concept of who validly, and this is a point that Phyllis has written about, of course, who validly is the icon of Christ? And so if there's a misogyny underlying the theology, then that needs to be exposed for what it is. But if there is truth in that a man can only be the icon of Christ, then it needs to be true everywhere at all times, otherwise it's not truth. These are sort of larger questions, but culture blocks it, tradition blocks it, the strong resistance and division within the church blocks it, especially, say, in North America, but also here in New Zealand and other places. So I think the future lies in a much richer and deeper catechesis, and it would have to begin in places like seminaries. So it would almost be a matter of trying to put liturgy and diakonia, service, as primary subjects that have to be taught. Well, we haven't got there yet with liturgy, and I doubt that we'll get there with service. So hopefully it might change.
Phyllis, I see you nodding. I'd like to leave the last word with you.
Well, there's never a last word because I think
well, there isn't the seminar, because otherwise we'll all die of thirst. So there's no last word in theology. There's no last word in the evolution of the church, but there's going to be a last word in the seminar.
Well, I wish we could go out for a pint after this, but it's a little difficult with where we are. The point that Joe makes really, and many of the points Justin has made, revolve around the evidence we have. But there are two ways of having this discussion. One is having a discussion that's a political discussion, and women should do this, and women have done this. And the other is a discussion that really involves the discernment of the Spirit and how the Spirit is moving in our church, in our world, and the needs of the people of God. I'm convinced that if the church needs women in the diaconate, the church will not be denied. But I think the important point here is that with the evidence we have, we can go back and forth, but we can't go back and forth in a political discussion. We must go back and forth in a true discussion that is one based in genuine discernment. You know, a wise bishop once wrote to me, and I'll read you a little note about what he says about discernment. He says, it's not an organizational technique, and it's not a passing fashion, but it's an interior attitude rooted in an act of faith. Discernment is the method, at the same time the goal. It's based on the belief that God is at work in the history of the world, in the events of life, in the people we meet and speak to us. This is why we are called to listen to what the Spirit suggests to us with often unpredictable ways and directions. As one might assume, he's a Jesuit bishop. But the fact of the matter is, I think our job as theologians and the job of the people of God is to, for us as theologians, to understand the needs of the people of God, and for the people of God to make their needs known. I think that is where the discussion, you said, where are we now and where we'll be in the future? If we don't have this genuine, discerning discussion, prayerful discussion, we won't be any place. And if we do, I think we will be able to move to a future where we'll restore the tradition of women in the diaconate.
Thank you, colleagues. I hope you have found listening in on our seminar of value in your own theological thinking on the question of women, ministry, and the diaconate. Justin pointed out that the history is fluid, and so the future can be fluid. Early in the debate, Phyllis mentioned the magical name of Robert Taft, Bob Taft. And one needs to have a certain American accent to do justice to quotations from Bob Taft. But Joe Grayland mentioned this whole idea of the icon, and it must be male. Well, I'd like to finish with a one-liner from Bob Taft in reply to a questioner who said, but surely it can never happen. And he said, if you can't, I really should try a New York accent. Maybe Phyllis, you can do it for me afterwards. If you can't ordain them, don't baptize them.